Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Pep Me Up Talk and Gathering here on the 26th of June, 2020. This is our 12th meeting together as a community, and it's an honor to be here with you. Today, we will be having a guest come join us, a member of our community. Dr. Angel Acosta will be coming in about 15 or 20 minutes into our time together. And as usual, we'll start with greetings from anyone who would like to type in the chat, hello. And we'll start with some music, this time Dreamers from Alex Siegel. Thanks for being here. And we'll also do, as we usually do, a review of some of the slides, this time a little bit changed, as we get ready to deeply dive into our discussion today. Thank you, Alex Siegel. In fact, that was Daydreaming Pilot, not Dreamers. So you have a new one now for your collection. And thank you, Alex Siegel, for that beautiful song. And hello, everyone. It's great to see you all here. And I'm going to go over a couple of these slides. So I'll keep myself very small here in the screen. And just say that as we dive into this material as the weeks unfold as a community, and whatever we call ourselves, we've used the term we community just as a simple reminder of the importance of embracing the reality of interconnection, the way fundamentally we're a part of a larger whole, and to avoid the propensity the human mind has to mistakenly think of itself as separate. So part of what this community is about is using the broad scope of science, a discipline that studies lots of different ways of understanding reality, to think about how we can use that broad scientific view. It's a frame called interpersonal neurobiology. And that term really embraces the idea that there are many forms of knowing that you can study in a disciplined way. And in this case, what we've done is taken the study of subjective experience and consciousness and seen in these 7 at least implications that when we do a practice, whether you call it mind training or opening awareness or developing mindfulness or cultivating presence, whatever terms we use, the idea is that there's a spaciousness beneath that separate identity view. And as we'll see, it may be that journey, joining with all sorts of wisdom traditions, indigenous cultures that have taught that being in the present moment is a key to opening something up. But what is that key and what does it open up? And those are the kinds of questions we're addressing in our scientific framework that we hope will synergistically join with other approaches. So when we look at this, then what we see is there are these ways we can learn to live from this plane of possibility, that hub of the wheel of awareness, that allows us to learn from this open, spacious place. And as we get ready to invite Dr. Acosta here to really have us sense, if we've been doing the wheel practice or any kind of practice that focuses attention, opens awareness, and even cultivates or releases the compassion and kindness that are natural to letting those happen, and even being in touch with a longing for how the world could be, maybe even how the world should be, but avoiding being committed to absolute outcomes and leaning into that direction. For example, the direction of empowering people to have health and dignity and joy in their lives. So when we do this with that kind of laughter and sense of joy and a deep love of life that allows us to lead from this place. Now, when we do it this way, we've seen that this community can be all about something that in academia we call pervasive leadership. So this isn't about a person standing up here in front of a camera, in this case, this person called Dan, saying, I know something that you don't know, but rather, how can we as a community empower one another so that each individual can be given the tools, the empowerment to embody and act, extend and embed these fundamental ways of being that dissolve the delusion of an isolated self, that bring out the intention, which is basically kindness, the attention, which is really to the present moment, and the information, which is, as Louis Pasteur said, the way that chance favors the prepared mind, so that in our human family, beginning perhaps in all these different communities around the world that are being awakened to the disruption of the pandemic, to say that the information we're looking for can drive the focus of our energy in a direction of wise action, that wisdom is at the heart of what we're doing. And what we want to do is do this with an openness, a flexibility, so that it isn't that we're committed or clinging or, specifying a specific outcome, but rather setting a direction on the course of what we're about. So if this is to be a community that's based in science, so this in some ways is a stance we're taking, and it is a MWE community in the sense that we're embracing the reality of interconnection and the importance of bringing awareness to that, and also highlighting a process called integration, which is where we honor differences, and in fact, we thrive on these differences, and then bring linkages to those differences. And we've said that if we begin with identity, the me is the individuated, differentiated uniqueness of who you are, you and the body that's hearing this body speaking. And when we bring them together, we have a simple term, which is MWE. And we're reviewing this because as we stay open to whatever's happening on the planet, we can see in some ways that the disruption of the pandemic which as a virus goes around the globe and shuts things down for humanity, we've seen that one of the things that that pandemic has highlighted is how profoundly interconnected we are. And so what we've done in our time together and in the foreseeable future as a community, we've said, what if we took this disruption and honored the incredible pain that is here, the suffering that's here? And as we saw last time, the idea of justice, in Rhonda McGee's term, is that justice can be defined as love in the action of reducing suffering, so that justice comes from love. We've also seen that we can use the focus of attention so that where our attention goes, we can actually change the very structure of our brain. And this then is sort of from the inside out. If you said, well, how can we as a community really make any difference? And this morning I had the privilege of being on a compassionate systems educational thing as a consultant and with many other consultants. And the portfolios, these projects that the individuals were doing were so filled with hope when you think in systems terms. And you can see how the brain may be prone to thinking in very limited terms, but when we open up to a systems level, things begin to change in a very profound way. Now, this spotlight of attention tells us that even as we're about to go step by step through not only seeing how the pandemic of a virus reveals our interconnection, but interconnection is also something we can pay attention to when it comes to looking at another pandemic, which is racism and the violence that comes from literally physical acts of violence, but also institutionalized acts of violence, where systemic racism is embedded within certain cultures. And here in the United States, it's rampant. And we'll be going into this in a very, very deep way. And from our point of view, from this community, we're using science not as something that restricts us, but something that helps us become empowered. We've seen that from a scientific point of view, the mind has these categories at the bottom, divisions that it makes. And we need to identify these divisions so that we don't get lost in the beliefs and ideas, the concepts, for example, like racism and race, that can imprison us. And the words then we use. So as Dr. Acosta and I will be speaking, we're going to be using words, of course, and also nonverbal ways of communicating, because we want to open up the dialogue about what is racism all about? What is anti-racism about? What is a way that people who are racialized as Black can speak with people who are racialized as white? And we're going to continue that discussion that we've been having now for many weeks, and that's been going around the world as a central point. So we've seen that, and this for those of you who are new, and I know we have many new members to our community, but so I invite you, the recordings are all there, but this is a slide that says that, let's say you're raised in a world where the racialization of people to be one group better than another. In the United States, white superior to Black. Then you'll have a kind of plateau which will restrict which other plateaus of thought and states of mind and attitude arise. And that the peaks, as we've seen, are particular emotions, particular memories, particular thoughts. And you can see from this, then, if you have a particular plateau that is creating these categories, and then certain other plateaus, which are the beliefs, that then drive your behavior, your way of thinking, feeling, and acting. Then what we have is a scientific view of what mindfulness practices do, loving kindness practices do, reflective practices of all sorts, indigenous teachings, wisdom traditions that have taught us that we need to go beneath what's on the surface, deeper, deeper, deeper. As you can say, dropping into awareness. Here, what we see from that, it would be dropping into the plane of possibility. that a practice, this is just one example, and there are hundreds of ways you can do this. This is not about the wheel of awareness practice. It's about doing practice so that you drop beneath the conditioned categories, the conditioned concepts, and then the words we use, dropping beneath those. So a brief story I'll tell you is I had the privilege of working with Elijah Cummings, the congressman from Baltimore. And as you may know, Baltimore is a city in America with one of the highest murder rates and tremendous amount of racial inequities in that city. So Elijah and I would do meetings together. In one particular meeting, we did the Wheel of Awareness. And before the wheel, there was incredible tension. There were people who had never met face to face before. People who were racialized as Black, people racialized as white, in this room together. We did the wheel, and after the wheel, the tension totally changed. And when people got into that hub of the wheel, the way they described it, and Elijah Cummings found it amazing to hear this, people felt the sense of interconnection with one another they didn't feel before the wheel practice, a sense of love and this open awareness where when you look at that, the hub of that wheel as a metaphor is, I believe, from a scientific point of view, the plane of possibility. So in that simple practice with Elijah Cummings, we could drop into the plane. And so when Elijah told the story of being a young boy, he's African-American, and in middle school, the counselor told him when he said he wanted to go to law school, who do you think you are as a Black adolescent that you think you could do this? And Elijah said it hurt him so much, and he was driven to do what he's done, which is become a lawyer, become one of the leading Congress people in our country. And sadly, he passed recently. But this was a way where you can see how a simple practice like the wheel, which is scientifically based, can help us transcend the tensions of these categories and concepts that are the basis for racism. And so we'll discuss more of that soon. And that, in a sense, when you drop into that hub through a practice, however you do it, if the wheel is good for you, great. If other practices do it for you, great. Dropping into awareness opens up the mind to the sense of uncertainty, which can be frightening at first. So people want to be certain to feel safe. But in that hub, there's this sense of interconnection, presence, and love. Presence being open, receptive awareness. And it has these qualities of curiosity, openness, acceptance, and love. And you know I'm an addict nut, so there's COAL is an acronym for today. And as we come to invite Dr. Acosta up in just a few minutes, let's bring that COAL state. Let's drop into that hub of the wheel as a metaphor. Let's access that plane of possibility to learn from Dr. Acosta and to be open to whatever is going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen. He doesn't know. You don't know. This is live, not just a recorded podcast or something that we're going to edit away. It's live. It makes it a community experience. It makes it a community gathering, and it makes it very raw. And I really appreciate Professor Rhonda McGee being here last week, and she has agreed to come back whenever she can make it in her schedule. So we're going to have a part 2 with Dr. Rhonda McGee, and a professor of law, JD. So she is a doctor of law. So Rhonda McGee will come back. We have many other people who have expertise in all sorts of different aspects of what integration in a new world might be like. And so with that, let's just review this one more slide, and then we'll bring Dr. Acosta in. I've got to tell you that I am so deeply inspired by the conversations happening at the MWE community. It's just incredibly moving to see what people are talking about, the depth of the connections, and the beauty of the questions. And I just want to touch on these 5 foundations we began with early on, just to say that these are not to be prescriptions that limit us. They're just a foundation to then build on. And with a strong foundation, we can go very far. So the idea of synergy, the first of 5 S's, is that there's something more to what's going on. So any one particular way, whether it's a wisdom tradition, a contemplative practice, whether it's a societal view, whether it's, a scientific view, whether it's something from any place, you want to see how does that fit with a larger picture of reality. So in interpersonal neurobiology, we call this consilience, Consilience. And so what we're going to do is look for consilience. That's the synergy. And we always want to ground this in our own subjective experience. So whether you are doing mindfulness practices in a traditional sort from wisdom traditions of all sorts, or you're looking at just the scientific practice inspired by the wheel, or you're doing your own version of reflective practices, you're getting in touch with what's happening in the present moment in your sensory world. This first person direct felt sense cannot be in any way replaced by intellectual thinking. So when we talk about the heart, not just the head, in part what we're saying is to feel it deeply embodied. And we've had our integrative movement practices, which we'll come back to later on. Let's go back to the recordings. And the science that we build on to see if it's synergistic, consilient, is this view of a disciplined study of reality that challenges basic assumptions and even itself. And I read every word of Dr. Acosta's dissertation in preparing for his coming today, which he just completed. And it's a beautiful example of a scientific rigor that actually draws on, in terms of spirituality, meaning and connection beyond the solo self and indigenous wisdom that I'm going to ask him about in just a moment. And all of this for our community as the 5th S is to not shy away from science, to really learn it deeply, not shy away even from the word spirituality when we define it in a very open way, like living with meaning and connection beyond a solo self. That's what we mean by that word, and we're not afraid of using it. But service is the key, a being of support and assistance to the well-being of the world. So it's imbued with hope, it's imbued with love. And what I'd like to do now with love and gratitude is invite Dr. Acosta to our platform. And thank you for diving into this overview. I hope it was helpful. And let me now stop sharing my slides, and you have the slides available to you. And let's hope that everything works out technologically for Angel Acosta to come up. And here he is.
Yes. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Dr. Acosta, welcome.
And Brother Siegel, how are you? Good to see you.
Good to see you. Good to see you. I'm going to get us on the same level. So I'm going to move my body back in the camera here and maybe move the camera away. All righty. Here we go. Good. Now, you're out in New York now, right?
Yes. I'm in the Bronx right now, in the borough of the Bronx. And I'm so happy to be here. So good to always wonderful to talk to you, and just to be part of the wonderful community you've been able to curate here. So everybody, wherever you are, sending tons of love your way.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, we welcome you. And I'd also love if you could give us kind of an invitation to really know you from the inside out, really, because your dissertation, I'll just say, shares your own inner journey, and then goes on saying, where you are and what you're trying to contribute to this world we live in. Mm-hmm. And I could certainly summarize it, and I'm very excited about it. And I want to ask you if you could share some insights into, where you came from in terms of coming to this incredible work and what the work itself is.
Yeah, it's a beautiful conversation that has been happening since I was born. When I was defending my dissertation, when I was defending the dissertation in front of my committee, then I told them that, to me, this is not a traditional dissertation defense, I said that this is more of a marker in my family's migration story. My parents came from Dominican Republic in the 1980s, part of the wave of migration from Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic and many other countries in Latin America in that time period, where the economies in the Caribbean and Latin America were not doing too well. So my parents came to New York to find a better life for us. And throughout, a 3-decade period, we struggled financially, and I happened to get some nice support in high school, even though I could have gone a very different direction in terms of my development. But I did get really good mentorship and applied to college, studied anthropology, a deep love for human beings, a deep love for culture, studied a master's in leadership studies, a deep love for leadership, a deep love for organizational development. And then I spent about 10 years working with young people around the country, helping them prepare for college. And in that process, I noticed that there was something missing. There was something missing in my work. I wanted to do more direct action in regards to social justice. And I was also developing my own self-care and mindfulness practice, doing a little bit of yoga here, a little bit of capoeira here, a little bit of meditation here. So I just gradually began to practice more. And I was curious about the relationship between social justice education, right? Teaching people to understand the structures that are in place that create inequality, that create and sustain some of the ways that resources are distributed in our society, and trying to change those conditions. So really thinking about social justice, but then also like the relationship between social justice and mindfulness, and the relationship to contemplative practice. And I just noticed some really fascinating things were happening in the field at that time. And I decided to take a leap and get a doctorate in curriculum and design and curriculum and teaching at Columbia Teachers College. And throughout that process of asking this question, what are the tensions between social justice, education, and mindfulness and contemplative practice? What was revealed to me was that teachers, especially in urban schools, and just American people in general, are burning out. There's a lot of burnout. People are working harder than ever before to make ends meet. Budgets are slimmer. Students are experiencing trauma. The work of adverse childhood experiences. Dr. Burkeen in California popularizing that. So the realization that trauma is real and trauma impacts learning, and how do we take into account trying to engage in social justice work and education, yet also tending to the harm that systems inflict on students, and then also doing it in a way that is gentle, that it's inviting, and that really harnesses some of the science that you talk about, our neurology, our physiology, our interpersonal neurobiology. So in the process of answering that question around the interconnection between social justice and mindfulness, I noticed that healing was at the core. Healing was at the core. And I just appreciate you because of the fact that you work with this notion of integration. And that's cool. That's crucial. We can talk a little bit about that later. So I ended up looking at this idea of healing-centered education, healing-centered pedagogies, approaches to education that are relatively holistic, that really take into account a person's mind, body, soul, spirit. But I didn't want it to be this loose kind of general thing that looked at healing as a beautiful possible approach and metaphor for instruction. I wanted to anchor it to something strong, something, and addressing racism seemed to be a place to really sink my teeth in. So I looked for a site where I could examine where healing-centered education was happening and where racism was being addressed or explored. So I studied a community of teachers within the Department of Education that spent 6 months developing what's called racial literacy, which means the literacy or the intelligence to be able to identify how racism unfolds on ideological, interpersonal, individual, and institutional levels. So being able to identify it and then being able to address it, especially interrupt it. So here I am exploring racial literacy development in the context of teacher and educational leader development. And then, so that was the site. The broad kind of category of healing-centered education was another umbrella. But I played with very specific theoretical frameworks that allowed me to have a rich and robust understanding of how racism unfolds in this country, but also drawing on indigenous ways of knowing and indigenous knowledge. And the beautiful thing, Dan, that there's a lot of synergy between some of the theories you kind of put out, and I wanted to make some connections with that today. But when you think about healing-centered approaches to education, you can look at the Waldorf school, you can look at Montessori, you can look at progressive education. All of those processes and ways of approaching education are healing and holistic. However, if you look close at the literature, the most profound healing-centered education approaches come from indigenous communities, specifically in response to colonial rule. Okay, very important point. That when you have indigenous people, especially First Peoples in Canada, in the States, in New Zealand, when you have the colonial rule, whether it be Canada, the United States, and then you have the communities that have to preserve their cultural knowledge and their emotional well-being, their children are being taken from their homes, put into boarding schools. Their land is being dispossessed. They're being pushed off the land. In that process of self-determination, you find the most powerful examples of people trying to be resilient in the face of catastrophe and displaying preservation techniques and approaches to self-regard that I would argue are the genesis of robust healing-centered pedagogies. So to close, it was a beautiful journey of weaving different theoretical approaches to understand more clearly how racism works, how it shows up in people's minds, in people's bodies, but a beautiful way of building a relationship with indigenous knowledge. And I'll end by saying that the power of indigenous knowledge is that it makes us think in ways that Western science just is not used to. And I'll end by saying this. So for example, in indigenous traditions, knowledge itself has agency. You and I can talk, and by our agential will or actions, we showed up to this call. Well, knowledge itself comes to us. So how do you develop the relationship with the knowledge that's coming up for you? You know, and so I just had a beautiful time applying some of these theories, carrying out my research as though it was an actual ceremony. And the last concept around relationality. You know, in indigenous communities, relationship is reality, right? Which connects to your notion of interconnectedness, which connects to the notion of Thich Nhat Hanh and interbeing. So, you know, long story short, there's a lot of synergy between some of the work that you've been putting up and putting out, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I channel the anger and the energy that's in the streets in terms of protest in light of the murders of many of the Black brothers and sisters who have died at the hands of police. So I'm here with force, with vigor and love. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Dr. Acosta, thank you. And may I call you Angel? Angel?
Yes, please,
Yeah.
please, please,
Yeah.
please.
So before we get into the specifics of the intervention that you studied, which I really want you to share with the community, just to take a step back to this last point you made about indigenous cultures and indigenous wisdom,
Yep.
that one thing that was so remarkable about reading your dissertation was to see how you identified indigenous approaches to understanding, how you were very straightforward about saying the traditional Western-centered, white-centered scientific approach not only had limitations, but it could be destructive. And you had it right out there. And you said that you needed to understand the relationality, not only of the intervention itself, which was so magnificent, but you as the researcher in your relationality to the people doing the research. So it was all these layers of kind of walking the talk, you know?
Yes.
And I just felt so inspired by you and by the work, and also just by the incredible insights that you were able to articulate that were so inviting, you know, as a reader of your dissertation. So I just want to, again, you know, thank you for that work.
Yes.
So beautiful, Angel, so beautiful. And in terms of the steps for today, and what Angel and I did in terms of the community, is we wanted to really dive deeply into this work, which is so important in general and so timely right now, but it's always been timely, you know, but it's on everyone's minds now across races. And talk about things in a way where, you know, if this person as a racialized white, if I want to make sure I get these words right, cisgender male, heteronormative, and then just to recognize this neurotypical, neurotypical, you know, being called this body, Dan. If I say something that is in big ways or little ways off or wrong or offensive or, you know, whatever, I want to offer to you for us to be open about that, to talk about as a, you know, as a black and white person talking to each other, that we could just use this opportunity to, you know, put it right out there. So that's one thing as we go forward. And another thing just to say is that, you know, you're now with a doctorate, right? So you're now in, you know, academic credential land. You know, there you go, right, in quotes, I know, and me too. So we want to honor also that there's, you know, and this is one thing that's special about this community that may put off some people. They don't want to know about science, and that's fine. We don't have to make science into scientism. It doesn't have to be a belief. It can be one of many sources of knowing that when done in an open way can be useful. When done in a closed way can be destructive. So even though we say we may have academic credentials and you know, scientific grounding, we open up to the wisdom of many ways of knowing, bodily knowing, indigenous knowing, that are equally as valid. They're just distinct. So integration involves opening up to these many ways of knowing and seeing if they can be conciliant, if they can fit together. So with that in mind, I want to just address, as we get into the details of the study, what was that like for you then to be embodying the principles of indigenous cultures and the embodiment of relationality while working in an academic world that needed you to write a dissertation for a doctoral degree? I mean, you know, and I know you just finished like 2 weeks ago, is it now?
Yeah,
you know, so it's really fresh. So if it's too traumatic, that's one question. And just to get you ready for another question I have is how the word trauma and healing, those two words, fit into looking about working with the issue of racial justice. You know, and so those are just some questions.
First of all, I just want to say hi to some of the people in the audience who speak Spanish. ¿Cómo están todos? Un saludo. Just to honor that. You know, and thank you for inviting me to, you know, call you in when there may be some tension between us.
Por seguro.
Yeah, and know that I invite you to call me in into some clarification. And I think what that points to is what Dr. Camila Majid calls cultural humility. Engaging in the pursuit of understanding and knowledge, knowing that your worldview has its limitations, and then surrendering to the power of collective knowing that can come from multiple perspectives. So I want to start with a level of humility that you yourself model and that I want to put out as well. In terms of the academic experience and embodying very non-traditional ways in the academy, I think it's important to know that there's been some really interesting movements in universities over the last 10 years, particularly this movement called slow scholarship. And it comes out of feminist scholars who began to question, like, why are we so obsessed with so much production? Why are we so obsessed with so much publishing? Why are we so obsessed with pushing out this dissertation factory and limiting the deep relationships that are required to produce knowledge in the first place, and the ways in which sometimes research is actually harmful? So I try to slow down in terms of the way that I approach the study. Also, indigenous ways of knowing, Black feminist thought and Black feminist theory are parts of the academy and the canon that usually don't get that much love, usually don't get that much shine. So I wanted to sacrifice my time, my energy, my heart to illuminate and shine some light on places that actually inform us in terms of how systems work for those who are most marginalized. So in doing that, it was exhausting, and in doing that, it was harmful for me in terms of taking, and I was working as well, so it was a very difficult journey. But as I was really wrestling with notions of healing-centered approaches, I had to put a mirror towards myself. So I had to do my own healing. How can I do healing-centered work or research without looking at my shadow, at what people call the dark precincts of my soul? So that commitment to doing self-work, that commitment to carrying out my study as though it was a ceremony with a sacredness, led to some really beautiful moments of insight and inspiration. And part of the indigenous approach to research is that there's a closeness. There's a really closeness with you and the subject you're studying, you and the ideas that you're exploring. And that, you see, that closeness is antithetical to the Western Academy. Because in the traditional science, there has to be a distance, a removal, enough for you to be objective, right? Well, I wasn't interested in being objective. I was interested in strong objectivity, what Sandra calls strong objectivity, which is getting really close. And the thing is, when you get really close, the process changes you as much as it changes.
Yeah.
So, and from quantum physics, when you look at particles at that level, you could literally impact the behavior of some of these photons and neutrons. So again, the relational approach to research tended to every single aspect of the research process. My relationship to the subjects, my relationship to the participants, my relationship to myself, my relationship to the institution, my relationship to the world in which the research was emerging in, and its political and economic and environmental disequilibrium. And lastly, to honor knowledge as agency, my relationship to the knowledge that was emerging. And it was those relationships and the proximity to those relationships that allowed me to finish. It allowed me to finish with, look at my face. I look well rested. I look good,
You
baby.
do. You look great, man.
Thank you. So here we are. And it was a pleasure. It was an honor. And I learned a lot about racial literacy. I learned a lot about Black feminist thought. I learned a lot about not just indigenous theory, but just indigenous what they call axiology, epistemology, ontology, very serious methodologies. And I'll just end by saying your concept of synergy in terms of the greater kind of whole is larger than the part. Another way of defining synergy from an indigenous approach is actually putting out enough energy in the community that actually takes into account the collective well-being. So for example, and science has caught up to this, and you know the science around kindness, right? You know how people feel when they're kind, those classic studies when people are actually kind and how that happiness radiates.
Yeah.
Well, that happiness radiates in the person and in the receiver because it generates synergy. So that's just kind of another way to kind of think about some of the stuff, and I'm excited to go deeper.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, first of all, it's just a joy to have you here, Angel, and to be together in this setting. And wow, we want to open it up for people that have questions. And I think what we'll do, and Christy, you can tell us whether the questions should come through the questions or the chat. Do you have a preference? In the ask a question, Christy is saying, and she will be monitoring those questions. But before we open it up, for the whole community to come on and ask you questions, Angel, I wonder if you can address the issue of, talking about healing and trauma.
Oh, yes.
And how, and maybe you can give an overview too of what your research project was and the intervention.
Yeah.
And just to underscore this, that, in the PEP meetings lately, we've been talking about the notion that, the idea that hope is an advocate for the love that drives compassion and the reduction of suffering, that we need to keep hope alive. And I found so much hope in your research project that was in your dissertation. And that, when we see that, and we see the idea, that Rhonda McGee said last time, that, that justice can be defined as love that is acting in the service of reducing suffering. That's a paraphrase, from Rhonda McGee. And even, one of our members, Patricia Gordon, she said that we have to go between flaming out and pressing the snooze button, And so in many ways, healing is in interpersonal neurobiology, we talk about a window of tolerance and, finding this kind of flow of integration between chaos on the one hand and rigidity on the other. The kind of flaming out is chaos. The snooze button would be rigidity. So in your journey into healing and your journey into trauma, in your own life, but in the dissertation, in the research, how did trauma fit into it? How do you see trauma and racism? And how do you see the work in schools for healing to help by focusing on healing and trauma?
Yeah. First, I'll say I appreciate Rhonda's framing of hope. I recently, I forgot the scholar's name, but the scholar that I read said hope as practice, hope as daily practice, not just this external value we bestow on the future possibility or promise of a better tomorrow, but rather something we do daily as a practice. And drawing from Dr. Cornel West, love, justice is what love looks like in public, in terms of our structures. So just wanted to honor Dr. West. In terms of healing and trauma and racism and the work that we did, what we want to understand is that this country, the United States, I stand on native land by the Wappinger people in New York, but this country, its founding, its genesis with bringing with the stealing of African bodies in 1619 and several years before that, and then the dispossessing of indigenous peoples, its genesis create 400 plus years where racism and inequality are entrenched, encoded, and reaffirmed. So it's important that when we think about trauma, there's intergenerational trauma that cuts across several generations. And you know, Dan, that trauma can be transferred through generations. Epigenetic research suggests that it can be transferred 4 to 7 generations. From the last thing I read, some people say more. So that the trauma that gets transferred through generations, sometimes encoded through the epigenetic structure or process, but also overlaid by the structures that a society puts in place, right? So if you have slavery and then you end slavery and then it becomes the convict lease system, and then it becomes the prison industrial complex, and then it becomes Jim Crow, and then it becomes redlining, and then it becomes segregation, and then it becomes underfunded schools, and then it becomes putting a knee on somebody's neck. You get a moment where people are not going to take this anymore. And that is trauma. That shows up in the body. And I feel it right now. The hyperarousal, the activation of parts of my brain, my amygdala, the cerebellum. You know the research. However, the healing is in the integration, right? How do I take these sensations I have right now, and I'm bringing a very difficult material, and when I see it in the media or on the street, or when I'm out in public and I see police, I activate parts of my neurology and physiology. I breathe into my diaphragm. I activate my autonomic system, and I breathe to integrate that prefrontal cortex and that other part of the brain that really deals with some of the difficult emotions. So what we know is that the snooze is important, right? So healing partly is engaging in really powerful mindfulness grounding practices while engaging in difficult conversation around structural harm and personal injury, because we know that trauma it hits the body, and it's very difficult sometimes to work with things that happen to us, not just in terms of race, but in terms of our lived experiences. I know you, brother, your people have experienced a lot, and I honor you. I honor the Jewish folk who have been resilient across thousands of years. You know, so it's like we all carry trauma. It just surfaces in different ways. And then I'll end by saying that the study that we did and looked at this professional development workshop, the finding was beautiful, that if you bring teachers together to have real conversations about racism, trauma, and how racism shows up in institutions, in our bodies, in relationships, in ideology, if you bring people together to have those genuine conversations and you create the community, two things came up. It was called a two-pronged praxis. Two-pronged praxis, meaning a practice with two approaches. The first, develop racial literacy. So the ability to feel comfortable talking about race, to feel comfortable naming how it shows up, and to feel comfortable interrupting, right? So racial literacy. But then the second prong was self-care, was healing. You know, so many of teachers who participated didn't even know how deep the wounding was. So the conditions that were put in place allowed them to slow down enough, engage in practices that really allow them to breathe, allow them to hear each other, see each other, bump heads at time. But what happened was that they developed this two-pronged approach of calling out racism, addressing it, approaching it, thinking about it, and then doing deep self-care, self-soothing, and really taking care of each other and taking care of each other and themselves. So even to the point where we had the instructor and had this thing called accountability buddies, and every week in pairs they would check in. Yo, did you take care of yourself this week? You know, did you do this? Did you do that? And then that accountability system ensured that, one, people were taking care of themselves, and two, we were going deep in terms of addressing structural harm and structural racism. And then in closing, integration. It really was the embodiment of integration. And of course, it wasn't a perfect study, a very small sample, but very insightful. The majority of the participants were people of color, and they just felt so affirmed. And even the white folks who were part of this process were just transformed. This one participant said, I became more in touch with my own family trauma by witnessing other people articulate their pain. So that your liberation, Dan, is connected to my liberation, and that interbeing, that interconnectedness is real.
Thank you. Thank you. Together, you know, we can do this.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so much I'm feeling. You can see in the chat, everyone is just so deeply inspired and connecting to you, Angel. So
thank you so much.
There's a deep place in that healing for a spaciousness that has no words. And there's also the incredible wisdom, you say, that when people could hear articulated another's journey and another's suffering, they themselves can get in touch. And so in the spaciousness of that healing, there's also a place for words and for telling the story. So when I think about when you and I were together in Southern California, and you led hundreds of people through at a scientific conference, through a journey of what you created was this, you know, and enlarged this 400 years of history of trauma. And I can't do it justice just with the words I'm saying, but I just want people to know that if you would have witnessed Angel guiding people through soaking in this history and really letting interconnection of whatever race you were walking through that timeline of the 400 years, and then sensing the intergenerational trauma in all the ways, whether it's, you think of it as just the ways epigenetically, we can talk about that later, but that you can have these ways of being vigilant for danger passed on. You can have attachment change. You can have adversity. You can have structural racism that gets embedded so that slavery really never ended, you know, and that lynching continues to this very moment, literally. And absolutely, people who are Black, but also a number of people of color. Yeah. Same thing in Arizona recently revealed, and a young man who was Latinx. So this is going to be hard to transition to just opening up from what you just did. But two things I'd like to do before I give you one more question and we open up to the questions is, you mentioned literacy, racial literacy, and I want to just bring up a book that isn't written yet that I hope you will write, Angel, on this topic.
Yes.
And we're all going to get it.
Done.
Okay, so Angel Acosta, who wrote the book called blah, blah, blah. And I look forward to that day when I hold it up and I said,
it's coming.
It's coming, and here it is. But before that, I just want to talk to you about two books. I'm reading a bunch of them, but two in particular I'm reading. I want to see how you feel about it. The first is How to Be an Anti-Racist.
Yes, Brother Candy.
Yeah. And I'm just going to, you can see the emergency going on here, but this is the emergency. And the concept here is that everyone has their mind-making categories.
Yep.
So the polarization of saying you're either a racist or you're not a racist is actually creating more racism.
Yep.
Right. So the idea that you're either a racist or you can engage in anti-racism, is very powerful in this book. So, and you resonate with these ideas too. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is one book. And of course, his prior book was Stamped from the Start, which is also a mind-blowingly thorough review of racism. The other one, and this, I think this is for everybody too, but definitely for white folk.
Yep.
It's called, White Fragility.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about why it's so hard for white people to talk about racism. And what's amazing about this book is it invites you to recognize that the difficulties as white people, and I never would have said this in general, and last week with Rhonda McGee, I was saying, I don't identify as white. I don't really use that term. And it's still true. But I have to say, I live in a white supremacist country that would identify this skin color as white. So I'm racialized white for sure. And I've had the privilege of being able to drive down the street. And when a policeman goes by, I don't get vigilant that it's going to be like a slave owner beating a slave or killing a slave, right? Yeah. So this book powerfully articulates the story of why white folks have got to get involved in this. This is not in terms of the future of us, because this happened in all sorts of eras. It happened in the 90s, it happened in the 60s, and we go back to business as usual.
Yep.
So the question I want to ask you before we transition to open it up is, what are your feelings, your thoughts, your ideas, your vision of how can we as a community of human beings on the planet, but especially, people in the United States for this country's issues, or even this MUI community, what can be done so that we don't go back to business as usual and get empowered by the fact that white folk and black folk, people of color and white people are getting involved in the protests? And what can we do to keep that momentum going so that we don't go back to business as usual and we make this 400 years that is done?
Yeah, brother. I'm glad you surfaced those books. And I watched you and Rhonda talk last week, and she brought up another book, My Grandma's Hands, by Resmaa Menakem. And he talks about white-bodied supremacy. So it's different. Sometimes when you talk about white supremacy or racism or racist, like a lot of people kind of like, oh, no, that's not me. So it's not, no, it's not. It's we embody bodies that are read in particular ways. And there's a spectrum of privilege. And we know that, the continuum is black and white, but the colorism is real. And the ways in which, different people in different communities experience oppression applies across the board. I think my response to that, it's a very broad question and it's beautiful and it's big. But what white people in particular, and everybody needs to understand, is that our collective liberation is dependent on how we treat the least of these. One. And two, this moment, you said it earlier, like people of color are suffering, black people are suffering, I would argue that white people are suffering too. And Resma talks about this. Resma talks about that in My Grandma's Hands. You see, the history of whiteness doesn't come into existence, as Kendi writes, until last 300-400 years. The notion of being white doesn't even come to existence. This country is seeded as a colony of folks leaving Europe, leaving oppressive Europe. And some of the trauma that's in the epigenetic coding of white folks has the suffering that hasn't been processed yet. And he talks about that very beautifully. But what I want to say is that at the other side of white fragility, at the other side of the spiritual bypassing that white folks have engaged in over the last several centuries with not wanting to address head-on race, is the prize. Your transformation is on the other side of that uncomfortable feeling. Your transformation, and then once you cross over and we can link hands as though we're really equal, ooh, we can get some stuff done. Because the actual work is bringing some equilibrium to a planet that we're consuming as though there's unlimited resources. Let's be real, Dan, that this whole race stuff is just like one thing. The real problem is the carrying capacity of our earth. The real problem is how we're treating the actual earth as though she's not our mother. So the solution, I think, is conversations like this, a surrendering from white folks in terms of this moment, and really, really engaging in humble understanding of their own limitations and the limitations of the systems they put in place. And then in terms of everybody else, really trusting, because let's talk about that. There's a mistrust here. You think after 400 years, I'm going to forgive? It's difficult, but I think the conditions can be put in place if we have genuine dialogue, if there's reparations in some regard. And that's a difficult conversation. For example, I am Afro-Latino. So my blackness, my connection to the black diaspora comes from Dominican Republic, the Caribbean. So for example, as an Afro-Latino, and a lot of people, when they think about reparations in the context of the United States, I have no connection there. I don't deserve any of that. But I am a firm advocate that reparations are long due. And that beautiful article by Nicole Hannah Jones from the New York Times yesterday came out. Read it, powerful. But it's time for repair. And like, look, I'm admitting I don't deserve any of that money. I don't deserve any of that structural support. But I am firmly supported because that's what's required right now. It's for us to let go, surrender. And let's create the conditions for us to really redistribute resources how they should be. There's just little musings. It's a broad question, and we could talk all day about that.
We could, and we might need to have a part 2 or 3 or 4 or whatever, Angel, if you're up for it. And I'll just say that, you're really pointing out something so important. And the pandemic of a virus shows the interconnectivity of things. The 400 years and what's happening now shows the interconnectivity, that when people are not honored for differences and that integration is impaired, you get the chaos and rigidity that is the source of trauma, right? And that social injustice is also an example of not embracing and rejoicing in interconnectivity. And then when you're talking about the planet, climate crises are all about impaired integration, meaning there's chaos and rigidity in the world because we're excessively differentiating, just like you're saying, acting as if there's unlimited resources, when in fact, we need to realize how deeply interconnected we are. As you know, in this community, we try to have a simple linguistic symbol for all of that. And the hope and love that's embedded in that, with the simple word me plus we equals the simple word mui.
Yep.
If anyone hears that and thinks we're trying to sell them some kind of trendy, fatty word or something like that, that's not what this is about at all. This is about a deep, deep healing of the trauma of disconnection. Right. And so part of the hope in reparations and part of the hope in reconnecting and really getting in touch back with indigenous realities, whether you talk about throughout the world, but talk about in North America, what about reparations for what we did with the genocide of Native peoples here in this continent?
That too.
So we live with all that trauma. And for white folk, to want to ignore it or act like there hasn't been a benefit off the black and brown and indigenous people's lives here, even if, like in my family, we didn't come till the 1900s, it's still a part of this country, that it's built from that. And so, that takes a lot of inner strength to do exactly what you're saying. How do you create the inner strength, the inner space, so that you can feel the guilt about it, you could feel the fury and rage about it, and hold that, so that, as in one of these books I was reading, I think it was in Kendi's book, that in identifying, even when people of color are showing these racist ideas, that is, one group is better than others, how he defines the racism, that in fact they're perpetuating the whole issue. So it's really moving to a very different space. Yeah. But I want to see if you have anything more you want to add at this moment in our discussion, and then open it up for the last 20 minutes.
I'll just say this very firmly. Very firmly. The very people we have historically tried to erase from this planet, we tried to dispossess of their land, we tried to extract from their labor and their bodies, are and contain some of the wisdom that we need to survive now. So it's a great return. It's a return. It's an acknowledgement. And not to say, because I think Western and white culture has something to offer, very powerful. Oh, just like, think about the systems that have been built to efficiently work, to sustain whiteness. That's a skill. So we can put that to good work. We all have things to offer. And it's just about being clear, being real, being raw. And so I hope that everybody gets this message that, yes, hope is a practice, healing, but there is a way to have this conversation with the anger and the righteous indignation in a way that still sustains you and I's relationship. Like, you and I have had conversations like this, intense ones, and I still love you.
Yeah, and I love you. And this is exactly, Angel, what this community and you and I here now in this particular moment need to see how to be open to that. So I can feel your anger and let it sit within me rather than have me run away.
Yeah.
Right. And I think, we're not getting into the details of your dissertation, but I'll just say the nature of the conversations that you facilitated, I think, did just that. From what I was reading and what I've seen you do.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of presence, just to use that term, to be present for another individual's trauma, and to hold the space within you, and you create it so beautifully as a group facilitator, to hold the space in the relational world, the relational field.
Yeah.
It can be, generative, as Meta Bull and Peter Senge and Otto Scharmer would use that term, and I know that's where we first met, hanging out with them. And, these generative social fields are exactly what we're talking about. So let's open it up and see if there are some questions from the community. And let me see, Christy, how you want to do this. Do you want to pick anyone and just bring them on, or do you want me to look through the questions? There's a lot of questions. So, okay, why don't you pick someone, and whoever it is will be fine. And I'm going to let Christy just look through and see questions related to what Angel and I are talking about, and just bring someone on. And it can be from the questions, Christy, or also from the, from the chat, anywhere you want. Okay, great. Okay, and now, Angel, this should work where there's going to be three of us on the screen in a moment. And just so for anyone coming on, just remember you're coming on, and this is being recorded. It's free for everyone, and but you will be public. So just, I think you know that, but it's just worth saying. And while we're waiting, Angel, sometimes it takes a little lag. You know, when you first saw in your dissertation work the emotional intensity that was rising, what were some of the key things as a group facilitator that you saw, and we can do that even here in this setting, were the most helpful for you as a facilitator to help encourage the kind of healing of trauma that you're so beautifully talking about, Angel?
Yeah, I think the slowing down. The slowing down is very important. Like you and I started this conversation. This conversation's tempo started, slow. We ease into it, and then it got fiery, right? And we got to honor that, honor the pacing of conversations, especially when it comes to dealing with trauma and healing. So for me, one of the most powerful things that I noticed was just creating enough silence in the self, in you, and in the community to allow to emerge what needs to emerge, what needs to be addressed. And then once there's enough space to allow whatever needs to emerge, meeting what has emerged with courage, with patience, with what Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams and Zenju Earthling Emmanuel call tenderness, like a tenderness. So I think that's my biggest take out of 5 years of doctoral study is the tenderness.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Slowing down and letting the tenderness emerge. And Victoria, you're joining Dr. Angel Acosta and myself. Welcome, Victoria. Where are you connecting to us from?
Vancouver, Washington.
Beautiful. Vancouver, Washington, across from Victoria, British Columbia.
No, it's across from Portland, Oregon.
Oh, okay. Across from Portland. Wonderful. Welcome.
Well, so actually, I think you answered a part of my question, but I didn't quite hear it. So my question was, what was most surprising for you and also most meaningful from your work? And what is it that you really want us to understand? So you mentioned tenderness, so I'm not sure if that was, but, and that's incredibly powerful because, so anyway, most surprising, most meaningful, and what do you really most hope we can understand?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for dialing in. Such a good question. The most surprising was you have, again, like Dan pointed it out, we have our biases. So even though I was gravitating towards indigenous knowledge, I had a bias. Subconsciously, I was entertaining these ideas, but maybe I didn't think I was going to find anything really powerful. Right?
Yes.
Because of the internalized racism that I have towards indigenous people and towards myself, maybe I doubted my own self and my intelligence. But I was just struck, surprised by just the power of the insights and their simplicity. Like, for example, one of the most meaningful things that I saw that came from using indigenous methodologies and understanding racism was this notion of research as reconciliation. So doing formal research, data analysis, data kind of collection, and in that process, literally understanding and learning about yourself and the world around you in order to reconcile with the very systems that weren't built for you.
Well,
So powerful. So powerful. So I feel so honored. And you all may sense that I have a lot of energy. And a lot of it comes from the confidence that I got from finishing this process. I am unapologetically me right now. I have no concern about what anyone thinks about my body, my mind, and it's in large part because of the reconciliation that I did with myself in relationship to an institution, Columbia, that has a very big, long history of reinforcing the very systems I was trying to rebel against. So, yeah, so that surprised me. That was meaningful. And just the importance of continuing to do your self-work, your own self-work, Victoria, and being gentle with yourself. Very gentle, very gentle.
Beautiful.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Victoria. Thanks.
Yeah.
And thanks for being a part of the We community. Thank you so much.
Thank you for creating it. It's beautiful.
We created it together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
And I know that some people have asked, is it possible to read your dissertation?
Yeah, so I will send the link. I have to find the link on ProQuest because it has to be published. So just so you know, it is out there in ProQuest. So I'll send it to Christy, but I'm actually planning on publishing it by the end of the summer. So by the fall, that book that Dan was talking about will be out. It's already there. I just need to organize and kind of pare it down a little bit. So it's coming.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. Great. And Christy, feel free to just, I'm letting Christy be the facilitator of the picking the button and that brings people on. So we'll be surprised, Christy, whenever someone comes. So Angel, you know, the inspiration of you saying, I'm unapologetically me.
Yeah.
I got to say, that fills me with so much joy,
Mm-hmm.
so much love for you, for in general, for life, and for you as a role model, really, for letting people see, you know, where we need to go in this world, you know, to really follow your heart and to bring that in. And we'll bring in now Felicity.
Felicity.
Well, hello. What a gift it is to be sitting with the two of you. So powerful right now. Thank you so much.
A pleasure. Where are you connecting to from?
Santa Cruz, California.
Syracuse. Wonderful.
Santa Cruz.
Oh, Santa Cruz, California. Oh, okay.
And I'm actually completing a dissertation on the impact of trauma on a student's capacity to learn.
Yes.
And I work with kindergartners right now who experience complex trauma. And I'm designing a program to address all the different levels of what you're talking about, because in the moment they're emerging in their identities. As children, they're coming into the world and they see very purely what everybody is doing in every moment, every inflection, every attitude. And a lot of them have experienced a lot of things like domestic violence, sexual violence, racial violence, a lot of stuff. And so I feel very fortunate. So when you're talking about intergenerational trauma, this is something that really hits the heart of humanity. And so the question I have for you is, one thing that's really hard for me is politicizing the ideology, all the words around this. Because when we're talking about inner beingness, we're talking about, I'm going to be right here with you in your perception, in your heart, with your face. I'm right here. And if we're going to confront all those different levels, there has to be transparency and authenticity. And things need to take time. So my main question was, how do you see the process of nonviolence in figuring in deconstructing all the ideas and concepts that we constantly live with in interrelationship all around us, and holding the space for not just the action of nonviolence, but the presence of nonviolence? Like, how are we going to balance that macro process of deconstruction and then that quantum process of like, I'm right here with you right now, but I need to let you have your grief. You know, and I need to have my experience of what that means, because it's multi-leveled. So I think that point is really important, is to focus on that nonviolence as we're cultivating these. And I just wanted to hear what you had to say about it.
Yeah. Well, that's a beautiful question. Thank you for asking that. And I think it's a very important question to ask right now. We need to understand that we live in a very violent society. Like at its core, American culture is very violent, whether we acknowledge it or not. It's violent physically, it's violent psychologically, and it has its virtue too. There are some beautiful things about our culture that I think are possibly opportunities for redemption. But we want to understand that hurt people hurt people. So that nonviolence is crucial for disrupting intergenerational trauma. If the violence continues, it's going to keep hitting every single generation. So nonviolence is key. And I want to acknowledge indirectly what you may be pointing at in terms of how do we respond to this current moment, because there are some real things that are happening. One, white supremacist groups are real. Dylan Roof did walk into a church and murdered 9 people 2 years ago. So there is real violence that comes from people who have a deep, deep hate, right? So there is real violence that's happening. And then you see the violence that happens in relationship to police brutality. So let's be clear there. And then the response from the public. Like, how does the public respond? Peaceful protests, the looting, right? The destruction of property. These are very important conversations. And I think that we should lean into them. My response is a bit provocative in terms of the larger relationship between nonviolence and change. Because I think there has to be nonviolence. But if the conditions are in place that continue to oppress people, people will choose to loot. People will choose to be violent. So that as a collective body, we need to understand that nonviolence is the priority, but the threat of violence is there. So my recommendation is we move forward with nonviolence as a community, but folks who are not invested in changing the systems for the better need to understand that if it doesn't change, down the line, people's stores are going to get smashed in. People will get so hungry that they will loot. So like it's a very paradoxical thing to hold, right? We prioritize nonviolence, especially when it comes to our babies. Oh my God, our babies, they're so cute, I just want to make sure we have enough resources so they can have great grandchildren and great grandchildren, right? So I want to honestly respond to that question with that nonviolence is crucial, and I come from that tradition. But we need to understand that violence is real on several different dimensions. From those who want to do it in a way to disrespect and to murder people who they see as different, and those who don't know how to channel their anger and rage. And it's if you want, a great example is Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. King negotiated with Johnson. Malcolm was there in the backdrop because if King failed, by any means necessary, so the threat of a powerful response to police violence and to structural violence was always there, real. So that there has to be kind of like a gentle relationship to both. And that's just real. Whether you agree with it or not, that's just what it is. And it's kind of beautiful with the yin and yang symbol. Like we can hold both tension. And I'll just let Dan respond because Dan introduced me to a colleague, Imodino, Dr. Imodino from USC. And she did a lot of research on learning and the brain later in life, but I think that the point she made was clear that people, when people are learning, especially children, and the learning is so powerful, they feel most alive. And when they feel most alive, the parts of the brain that light up are in the substrate. And that part of the brain is in large part involved with like your vital functions, your breathing, your autonomic. So think about that. When we feel most alive, the functions that keep us alive activate. So it's just a beautiful moment for you to do your research, and I commend you, and I thank you for the really hard question, because that's what Dan and I should be doing. Everybody should be doing. Let's talk about the hard questions. So thank you for asking that very hard question.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Felicity. Great to be here with you. Oh, wow. You know, Angel, I'm seeing the time when we just have literally 2 more minutes before we kind of come to a close. And as you know, we always kind of end with a song, and people can write in their greetings to you. And so if you're up for staying, we'll get that started in a moment. There's so much to say, and I hope you'll be open to coming back and we can continue a dialogue together, you know, as we go forward. But I just want to give you the space now. If there are any closing reflections, any comments you want to make, I could add to what you were just saying with Felicity, but yeah, I think it would well, there's a lot to say, and I'll leave that for part 2.
I wrote like 4 pages of notes, Dan, back in the classroom. But you know, I'll just say that, you know, we really are a very special, we're in a very special moment in human history. You know, things are dark with the pandemic, and with the pandemic of racism and the economy, you know, it's hard, you know, negotiating whether to open your business, and the fact that many states are flaring up again, you know, kids learning at home and not wanting, you know, disconnecting, you know, it's a really hard time. And at the same time, we've never had this much technology. We've never had this much resources, there's many resources. So it's a very paradoxical moment, and I want to invite everybody to lean in and to continue to be tender with yourself. Breathe through this process. We're going to make it. We're going to be fine. And just to really try to do the best you can to find a harmony in yourself and in your consumption of the resources in this beautiful planet. And just try to be as loving as possible. Just really basic. But of course, continue to educate yourself around these concepts. Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, Angel, thank you so much. You know, the love that this body feels, I think you can see from the whole community sharing with you, is huge. And from a scientific point of view, you know, we're not afraid to talk about love in this community. That love and awareness and interconnection are the heart of life. And it's the heart that we release that can make this moment in human history a different one. We bring together the power of indigenous wisdom, the power of the felt internal sense, and the power of science to come together and try to bring us to a more integrated, loving way of being in the world. So, Dr. Angel Acosta, we thanks you so much, and the future will hold much for future conversations. I'm going to play the song There Is No Other by Westerns and Alex Siegel, and wish you, let me get the songs here. Wish you a wonderful week and time, and until the next time, great to be with you. Thank you for being with us, and you can watch the comments on the side as we go, and we'll play the music. Thanks so much, Angel. Great to be here with you. Big virtual hug.
I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, talk to you soon. Yeah. Angel can stay on the screen. One moment. For some reason, it doesn't want to play here. Let's see why. Hold on a second. Go home. 1 second here. Here we go. Okay. You know something? I'm going to, it's so interesting. It's giving me a bunch of songs here that aren't,
it's the generative field we activated.
I know. You know what I'm going to do? I'll apologize to Alex, but I'm going to play it off my phone. Here we go. I'm going to play it off my phone. Let's get it. Here we go. Yeah. Here we go.
In the rolling tide, saw you in another life. No fear, we still got time, won't slip away. This kind of love don't fade, won't make the same mistakes. Anyway, I'm not afraid, I'm on my way. Oh, 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 oh. We come alive, we come alive. Heaven knows why. We're gonna try. There's no other love. We come alive, we come alive. Heaven knows why. We're gonna try. There's no other love. This heart is made of glass. You see just who I am. I know you understand. You call my name. I follow what I know. Caught in the undertow. I'm only flesh and bone. I'm on my way. Oh, 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 oh. We come alive, we come alive. Heaven knows why. We're gonna try. There's no other love. We come alive, we come alive. Heaven knows why. We're gonna try. There's no other love. We come alive, we come alive. Heaven knows why. We're gonna try. There's no other love. No other love. No other love.
Beautiful song, Dan.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Muchísimas gracias, Doctor. Great to be with you. It's really, really beautiful. Thank you to everyone in the community, and keep on connecting in the MUI community conversational platform that we have for one another. Have a beautiful week. Hold on to the love. Let it come out and be and integrate and interconnect us all. And again, Professor Dr. Angel Acosta, muchísimas gracias y hasta luego.
Hasta luego, hermano.
Be well, everyone.
Take care, brother.